The night Kang-lee walked into the glass-domed botanical ballroom, he was supposed to be shaking hands with corrupt billionaires to secure a syndicate alliance. He walked out with a war. The charity gala was drowning in opulence, the kind of suffocating wealth that hid blood money beneath champagne bubbles and the gentle hum of classical strings. Kang-lee moved through the sea of elite socialites like a predator forced into a cage of peacocks. In his sharp, midnight blue velvet tuxedo, men stepped aside before he even looked at them. Waiters trembled when offering him a glass. 3 lieutenants flanked him at a respectful distance, close enough to catch a bullet, far enough to pretend they weren't watching his every breath. This was the life of Kang-lee, the most ruthless boss in the Korean underworld, a man who had ordered seasoned killers to their knees and made entire syndicates rethink their ambitions, a man who years ago had forced the only woman he ever loved to walk away and never come back. He had done it to protect her. That was what he told himself every night when his sprawling estate grew too quiet and the imported whiskey in his glass stopped tasting like anything at all. The strategic alliance he was here to finalize was not something he wanted, it was something his empire needed, a political bridge to keep sadistic rival mobsters like Chairman Choi from starting a bloodbath in the streets. Chairman Choi was cold, calculating, and ambitious. He wore his legitimate business fronts like a weapon and spoke in pleasantries that always carried a hidden blade. Kang-lee had no illusions about what tonight's handshake would be, a transaction. But as Kang-lee adjusted his collar and glanced toward the brilliantly lit auction stage, his breath caught in his throat. The strategy, the alliance, and his untouchable reputation evaporated in an instant. She was there. Priscilla stood under the glaring lights in a breathtaking, plunging emerald gown. She looked regal, defiant, and devastatingly beautiful. And dangling from her elegant fingers, offered up to the highest bidder in a room full of oblivious billionaires and circling wolves, was the bespoke, priceless necklace he had given her in secret on their wedding day. The crystal chandelier cast fractured light across the grand botanical ballroom, but Kang-lee felt only the oppressive weight of the evening. He despised these masquerades. The elite of society fluttered around him in silk and diamonds, their laughter sharp and hollow. To them, this charity gala was an extravagant playground. To him, it was a battlefield. He adjusted the cuffs of his midnight blue velvet tuxedo, his dark eyes sweeping the perimeter with practiced, lethal efficiency. His lieutenants, stone-faced and immaculate, moved in perfect sync with his strides, forming an invisible barrier between their boss and the high society vultures. Conversations died instantly as he passed. Glances were hastily averted, replaced by frantic, hushed whispers behind crystal champagne flutes. They knew exactly who he was. They knew that beneath the tailored velvet and the philanthropic facade beat the heart of a man who controlled the city's shadows with an iron grip. Kang-lee was a phantom forged in violence, yet he commanded a fearful respect that bordered on reverence. He hadn't built his sprawling underworld empire by asking for permission or showing mercy, but tonight required a different kind of weapon, diplomacy. At the far end of the ballroom, seated heavily in a velvet-roped VIP alcove, was Chairman Choi. The rival boss was holding court, sipping vintage champagne with a wide, synthetic smile that didn't reach his venomous eyes. This was the man Kang-lee was here to pacify. A formal syndicate treaty was the only way to prevent their escalating Cold War from spilling into the bustling streets and disrupting the fragile criminal ecosystem. It was a bitter pill, swallowing his pride to negotiate with a man he loathed, but Kang-lee's empire had grown too vast, too precarious to risk an all-out bloodbath over petty territorial disputes. Choi caught his eye across the crowded room and raised his glass in a slow, mocking salute. Kang-lee's jaw tightened, a solitary muscle ticking beneath his skin. He returned the gesture with a microscopic nod, a silent promise that the midnight negotiations would proceed as planned. He had spent the last 5 years meticulously isolating himself, stripping away every vulnerability, every emotional tether that could be exploited by vultures like Choi. He lived in a fortress of his own making, a solitary king reigning from a throne of ice. He subtly signaled his men to take their positions near the exits. The charity auction was about to begin, serving as the tedious prelude to the backroom treaty negotiations. Kang-lee took his designated seat near the front of the stage, his posture rigid, his brilliant mind already calculating the intricate, deadly moves of the impending meeting. He was completely prepared for betrayal. He was prepared for an armed ambush. But as the ballroom lights abruptly dimmed and the auctioneer stepped up to the microphone, the untouchable boss of the underworld was entirely unprepared for the ghost that was about to walk out from behind the velvet curtains. The backstage air was stifling, thick with the scent of hairspray and nervous anticipation, but Priscilla's hands were completely steady. In her palms rested a fortune in platinum and blood-red stones. The bespoke ruby necklace felt heavier than it looked, carrying the dense, suffocating weight of 5 long years. She ran her thumb over the flawless teardrop center stone. It had been a secret wedding gift, clasped around her neck in the quiet intimacy of a moonlit room by a man who had promised her the world, only to shatter it into a million irreparable pieces days later. Kang-lee had abandoned her without a word of explanation, leaving her stranded in a luxurious, agonizing purgatory. For years, she had hidden this necklace away, treating it like a cursed relic of a ghost she was desperately trying to forget. Every facet of the rubies seemed to hold a trapped memory: his touch, his whispered promises, the devastating coldness of his sudden departure. But tonight, the relic was just a rock. Priscilla took a deep, centering breath, smoothing the heavy emerald silk of her gown. She wasn't that shattered, discarded girl anymore. She had spent 5 years meticulously rebuilding herself from the ground up, fighting for a foothold in a world that favored the ruthless. But independence required capital. True, untouchable freedom required a foundation that no man could ever rip away from her again. Selling the necklace was her final act of severance. The millions it would fetch from this room full of vain, competitive billionaires would fund her new venture and officially sever the last invisible chain binding her to a past she could no longer afford to carry. "You're up, miss," a stagehand whispered, gesturing toward the heavy velvet curtains. Priscilla nodded, her expression hardening into a mask of serene confidence. She draped the exquisite piece over her hand, letting the diamonds and rubies cascade like frozen fire against the dark green fabric of her dress. She stepped out of the shadows and into the blinding glare of the stage lights. The sudden hush that fell over the grand botanical ballroom was palpable. Hundreds of greedy eyes locked onto the glittering masterpiece she held, but Priscilla kept her chin high, projecting an aura of untouchable grace. She didn't look at the sea of faces. She didn't care about the corrupt tycoons or the whispering socialites. She was here for her future. She offered the necklace to the room, completely unaware that the very man she was trying to erase was sitting mere yards away, his heart stopping in his chest as the violent shadows of his world already began to close in around her. The auctioneer's voice rang out through the grand ballroom, and the polite murmurs of high society instantly dissolved into a frenzied spectacle of wealth. 2 million, 3 million. Paddles flew into the air as oblivious tycoons competed for the blood-red masterpiece, completely blind to the tragic history dripping from its facets. Then, a heavy, chilling drawl cut through the noise from the VIP alcove. 4 million. The ballroom quieted. Chairman Choi leaned forward against the velvet rope, a predatory smirk curving his lips. He wasn't just bidding on a piece of jewelry, he was asserting territorial dominance. But what made Kang-lee's blood run icy cold wasn't the bid, it was Choi's gaze. The sadistic mobster wasn't looking at the ruby relic. His eyes were slithering up the emerald silk of Priscilla's gown, dark with sudden realization and malicious calculation. Choi knew who she was. He had found the solitary crack in Kang-lee's armor, and winning that necklace would be his first step in claiming the woman connected to it. In his seat, Kang-lee felt a lethal, suffocating rage ignite behind his ribs. The diplomatic strategy, the fragile syndicate treaty, the years of meticulous isolation, it all incinerated in a split second. He could not let Choi touch a single facet of that stone, and he would die before he let the man cast his shadow over Priscilla. Before his lieutenants could even subtly gesture for restraint, Kang-lee rose to his feet. The movement was smooth, but it radiated a terrifying kinetic menace that instantly froze the people seated around him. 5 million, Choi called out again, his synthetic smile widening as he dared anyone in the room to challenge him. Kang-lee didn't wait for the auctioneer to acknowledge the number. He stepped into the center aisle, his presence consuming the ballroom like a storm cloud. 10 million, Kang-lee said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the chilling resonance of an executioner's blade. It sliced through the classical music and the champagne-fueled haze, hitting the room like a physical shockwave. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Socialites lowered their glasses in stunned disbelief. Across the room, Chairman Choi's smile vanished, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits as the realization dawned. The untouchable king of the underworld had just blown his cover and declared war in the middle of a charity gala. The auctioneer stammered, completely paralyzed by the hostility radiating from the man in the midnight blue velvet tuxedo. Kang-lee ignored the whispers, ignored Choi's bristling bodyguards, and ignored the catastrophic ruin of his own underworld strategy. Slowly, his dark eyes lifted toward the stage. Under the blinding spotlights, Priscilla went completely rigid. Her breath hitched as the unmistakable, haunting cadence of his voice reached her ears. She looked down into the sea of faces, and amidst the shock and opulent chaos, her gaze collided violently with Kang-lee's. The ballroom faded into nothingness. The ghost of her past was no longer a memory. He was standing right there, burning his own world to the ground just to look at her. The heavy oak doors of the VIP anteroom slammed shut, cutting off the frantic buzzing of the ballroom, but the silence inside was deafening. Priscilla whirled around, her emerald gown snapping around her ankles like a whip. The polished veneer she had maintained on stage was completely gone, replaced by a fierce, trembling fury. Kang-lee stood leaning against the closed door, his broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy, measured breaths. He had envisioned this moment 1,000 times in the dark, but nothing could have prepared him for the agonizing reality of standing mere inches from her again. The scent of her perfume, jasmine and vanilla, hit him like a physical blow. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice shaking with 5 years of suppressed rage. "How dare you walk in there and humiliate me? That was my future, Kang-lee. That necklace was my ticket out of the shadow you left me in." "I wasn't going to let Choi buy it. I wasn't going to let him buy you." Priscilla let out a bitter, breathless laugh. "You don't get to protect me. You lost that right the day you walked out without a backward glance. 5 years, Kang-lee, 5 years of absolute silence, and now you just drop $10 million to lock me back in your cage?" Tears of pure frustration gathered in her eyes, threatening to spill. "Why did you leave? Tell me." Every instinct screamed at him to cross the room, to pull her against his chest, and confess every wretched, bloody truth he had carried to keep her safe. He took a hesitant step forward, his hand raising instinctively to wipe the tears from her cheek. But as he moved, a subtle, chilling reflection caught his eye in the antique mirror mounted behind her. The frosted glass panel of the anteroom door darkened. Shadows were moving in the corridor outside. Not his men. His lieutenants were heavy, distinct wingtips. The footsteps vibrating faintly through the floorboards were silent, tactical. Choi's enforcers. They weren't just watching anymore. They were positioning. Kang-lee's blood ran cold. By violently asserting his claim over the necklace and over her, he hadn't just broken a treaty, he had shown Choi his only weakness. "Why won't you look at me and answer?" Priscilla's voice cracked, demanding the closure she had bled for. Kang-lee's hand dropped. The remorse in his dark eyes instantly vanished, replaced by the lethal, calculating stare of the underworld king she despised. He stepped past her, pulling a suppressed pistol from the inner pocket of his velvet jacket. "Because we are out of time," he whispered, chambering around. "Get behind me." Across the chaotic expanse of the ballroom, Chairman Choi swirled the remaining champagne in his crystal glass, a slow, malicious smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. The panicked whispers of the socialites swelled around him, but Choi was completely hyper-focused on the empty doorway where Kang-lee and the stunning woman in the emerald gown had just disappeared. For 5 years, Kang-lee had been a ghost wearing a bulletproof vest of absolute apathy. He was an impregnable fortress, a man who negotiated treaties with the cold, mechanical precision of an executioner. He had no visible vices, no family, and seemingly no soul. It was exactly what made him so terrifyingly effective. But tonight, that myth had shattered in a spectacular public display. A $10 million bid barked across a crowded room was not a business transaction. It was a desperate, unhinged act of possession. Choi set his glass down on the velvet-draped table. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with devastating clarity. The bespoke ruby necklace wasn't the prize. The woman was. "He loves her," Choi murmured to himself, the realization tasting sweet like poison on his tongue. The untouchable king of the underworld had a pulse after all, and it was currently beating violently behind the frosted glass of the VIP anteroom. Choi raised a single diamond-ringed hand. Instantly, his head enforcer, a hulking shadow of a man with a scarred jawline, stepped forward and leaned in. "Change of plans," Choi whispered, his voice a low, gravelly hum that cut through the surrounding noise. "The treaty is dead. We have a much more lucrative opportunity tonight." He looked up, his reptilian eyes scanning the massive, glass-domed botanical garden. There were 4 main exits, each currently guarded by a mix of Gala security and Kang-lee's own oblivious men. "I want the perimeters sealed, lock down the heavy steel service doors, and jam the building's security feeds. Instruct our tactical teams in the corridors to move in on the anteroom, quietly." Choi adjusted his silk tie, his smile widening into something truly monstrous. "Take out his lieutenants at the exits first, trap them inside. Do not let Kang-lee or the girl leave this building alive." The enforcer gave a curt nod and vanished into the frantic crowd, communicating the lethal orders silently through his earpiece. Choi leaned back in his plush velvet seat, steepling his fingers. The charity gala had promised to be a tedious evening of feigned politeness and forced compromises. Instead, it was about to become the perfect slaughterhouse. By the time the oblivious billionaires realized they were locked inside a gilded cage, the reign of Kang-lee would be over, and Choi would stand alone at the pinnacle of the city's criminal empire. He watched his men glide like sharks through the oblivious crowd, waiting patiently for the first drop of blood to fall. The frosted glass of the anteroom door exploded inward. A deafening barrage of suppressed gunfire ripped through the heavy oak, showering the antique Persian rug in jagged, glittering shards. Kang-lee didn't flinch. He shoved Priscilla hard against the concrete load-bearing wall, shielding her body with his own as bullets chewed through the plaster where they had stood a mere second before. Outside in the grand botanical ballroom, the muffled thump of tactical weaponry was suddenly swallowed by the piercing, frantic screams of the social elite. The slaughter had begun. "Stay low," Kang-lee barked, his velvet tuxedo quickly coated in a fine layer of white plaster dust. He pivoted around the edge of the shattered doorframe, his weapon barking twice. 2 heavy, sickening thuds in the corridor confirmed his aim. He reached back without looking, his large hand wrapping blindly, protectively around her wrist. "We have to move, now." Priscilla didn't scream, nor did she freeze. The terrified, heartbroken girl he had left behind 5 years ago was dead. In her place was a woman forged in the harsh reality of independence and survival. She kicked off her towering stilettos, the priceless rubies on her neck flashing in the emergency strobe lights that suddenly bathed the corridor in a harsh, pulsing red. She gripped his hand tightly, her bare feet silent and grounded on the glass-strewn floor. They surged into the hallway just as 3 more of Choi's heavily armed enforcers rounded the corner. Kang-lee dropped one with a ruthless center-mass shot, but the second returned fire, forcing them to dive behind a massive marble pillar. They locked the perimeter, Kang-lee gritted out, ejecting his spent magazine and reloading with practiced, terrifying speed. The main exits are death traps. We need to go down. The auction vault, Priscilla realized, her breath coming in sharp, adrenaline-fueled gasps. Level -2, it's reinforced steel. Can you run? She didn't answer with words. She nodded, her jaw set in a fierce, unyielding line. Kang-lee leaned out and laid down a deafening blanket of covering fire. Together, they sprinted for the service stairwell. They moved in sync, a desperate dance of survival amid the chaos. When an enforcer ambushed them on the first landing, lunging from the shadows to knock Kang-lee's weapon aside, Priscilla didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy, solid brass fire extinguisher from the wall bracket and brought it down viciously on the assailant's skull. The man crumpled to the concrete. Kang-lee stared at her for a fraction of a second, a flicker of profound awe piercing through his lethal focus. He retrieved his gun from the floor, giving her a single, affirming nod. They descended deeper into the belly of the building, the sounds of the massacre above echoing down the concrete shaft like thunder. Bursting into the subterranean security level, they bolted toward the massive circular vault door at the end of the hall. Bullets sparked and ricocheted off the steel walls behind them as Choi's pursuing tactical team flooded the stairwell. Kang-lee shoved Priscilla inside the reinforced chamber, turning to fire 3 final, precise shots into the corridor before grabbing the heavy locking wheel. With a deafening groan of industrial steel, the vault slammed shut, plunging them into utter, pitch-black silence. The pitch-black silence of the vault pressed against them, heavy and suffocating. The only sound was the jagged rhythm of their breathing and the distant, muffled thuds of Choi's men hammering against the reinforced steel door. Kang-lee reached into his pocket and clicked on a small emergency tactical light, casting a stark, narrow beam across the cold metallic floor. Priscilla stood leaning against a wall of safe deposit boxes, her emerald gown torn at the hem, the priceless rubies still resting against her collarbone. She didn't look terrified. She looked exhausted and fiercely resolute. "Tell me," she whispered, her voice slicing through the heavy, stagnant air. "If we are going to die in this steel box, Kang-lee, do not let me die thinking you threw me away for nothing." Kang-lee lowered his weapon. It felt completely useless compared to the crushing weight of her words. He leaned back against the opposite wall, the adrenaline finally bleeding out of him. It left behind only the raw, agonizing wound he had carried in secret for half a decade. "I didn't throw you away," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp, shedding the untouchable mob boss and revealing the fractured man beneath. "I buried you to keep you alive." He looked up, forcing himself to meet her eyes in the dim, sharp light. 5 years ago, the syndicate war was tearing Seoul apart. I was rising too fast, making too many dangerous enemies. One night, I found a small wooden box on my desk in the penthouse. Inside wasn't a threat directed at me. It was a photograph of you sleeping in our bed and a single lock of your hair. Priscilla's breath hitched. Her hand flew instinctively to her neck, resting just above the rubies. "They bypassed my highest security. They were inside our sanctuary," Kang-lee continued, the memory dragging him back into the darkest night of his life. "If my rivals knew you were my heart, they wouldn't have just killed you. They would have tortured you slowly to completely break me. The only way to save your life was to make the underworld believe you meant absolutely nothing to me, a fleeting mistake, a transaction I grew tired of. So you destroyed us, she breathed. Tears finally spilled over her dark lashes, tracing clean tracks through the white plaster dust on her cheeks. You shattered me just to convince them? I shattered my own soul, he corrected softly. He pushed off the wall and closed the distance between them. He reached out, his calloused, bloodied fingers trembling as they gently brushed a tear from her jawline. Every single day of those 5 years, I watched over you from the shadows. I ensured you were safe. But the moment I raised my voice to claim you tonight, I knew I was signing a death warrant. I just couldn't stop myself. I saw you on that stage, and the empire didn't matter anymore. Before Priscilla could process the absolute magnitude of his confession, a blinding shower of orange sparks hissed around the circular seam of the vault door. The intimate, fragile space they had carved out in the dark was instantly obliterated by the deafening screech of a thermal breaching torch eating through reinforced steel. Kang-lee's tender gaze vanished, immediately replaced by the cold, calculating eyes of a cornered apex predator. He killed his tactical light, plunging them back into total darkness, and shoved Priscilla roughly behind a towering stack of steel lockboxes. "There is an emergency ventilation shaft at the rear of the vault," he ordered, his voice barely audible over the roaring sparks. "When the door blows, the pressure change will trigger the fire suppression system. Use the fog. Climb out." "I am not leaving you," she screamed, her hands desperately clutching the lapels of his ruined velvet jacket. "You are going to live," he commanded, gripping her face in his hands one last time, his thumb grazing the rubies at her throat. "That is the only thing that matters." A concussive explosion rocked the subterranean chamber. The massive steel door groaned, buckling inward before violently giving way. A tidal wave of smoke, pulverized concrete, and the blinding glare of tactical flashlights poured into the vault. Suppressed automatic gunfire instantly shredded the space, ricocheting dangerously off the metal walls and showering the floor in sparks. Kang-lee didn't hesitate. He stepped out from their cover into the breach, becoming a deliberate, massive target. He raised his weapon, his face set in stone, and unleashed a lethal, precise volley into the encroaching tactical team. 2 of Choi's men dropped instantly, their body armor useless against his terrifying accuracy. But there were too many. Through the chaotic, stroboscopic flashing of muzzle fire, Kang-lee saw a hulking enforcer raising a heavy assault rifle. The barrel was tracking past Kang-lee, aiming directly toward the narrow gap where Priscilla was struggling to pry open the heavy iron grate of the ventilation shaft. There was no time to reload, no time to adjust his aim. Kang-lee threw his body across the firing line. He became a human shield, absorbing the sheer, devastating force of the attack to ensure she remained untouchable. A sickening, visceral thud echoed beneath the gunfire as a high-caliber round tore through his side, spinning him violently. The impact stole the breath from his lungs, painting his midnight blue tuxedo with a sudden, heavy bloom of crimson. He hit the concrete floor hard, his vision rapidly fracturing into hazy shards of light and shadow, but his gun never wavered. Propped on one elbow, he fired his final 3 rounds, watching the enforcer crumple lifelessly to the ground. Through the rapidly filling chemical fog, Kang-lee saw Priscilla's tear-streaked face looking back at him from the open grate. Her lips moved, screaming his name, but all he could hear was the fading, high-pitched ring in his ears. He gave her one last bloody smile, commanding her with his eyes to run, before the heavy darkness of the vault finally pulled him under. The sterile beep of a hospital monitor was the first sound to pierce the suffocating darkness. Kang-lee woke to the sharp, agonizing burn of a sutured bullet wound and the blinding white walls of a highly secured private medical suite. He had survived, but more importantly, the war was finally over. In the chaotic aftermath of the gala, Kang-lee's remaining loyalists had descended upon the botanical gardens with a ruthless vengeance. Without Chairman Choi to lead them, the rival faction had crumbled, systematically dismantled, and completely erased from the city's underground ecosystem within 48 hours. The bloody, tense stalemate that had choked Seoul's criminal empire for over a decade was permanently broken. But Kang-lee had no desire to wear the blood-stained crown. From his recovery bed, he issued his final, absolute decree. He meticulously dismantled his syndicates, transferred his legitimate assets to trusted civilian hands, and formally stepped down from the throne he had bled to build. The phantom who had ruled the shadows of the underworld simply ceased to exist. 3 months later, the afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow across the polished hardwood floors of an upscale, sunlit boutique in the heart of the city. The air smelled of fresh jasmine and expensive leather, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of blood and gunpowder that had entirely defined Kang-lee's past. He stood across the street, leaning lightly on a silver-handled cane. He wore a simple, tailored charcoal suit, stripped of the heavy velvet and the invisible armor of his former life. Through the expansive glass window, he watched Priscilla. She was laughing, directing a small team as they arranged elegant displays for her grand opening. Funded by her own ingenuity and the quiet, anonymous backing she had recently received, she looked radiant, completely unburdened by the ghosts that had once haunted them both. Kang-lee crossed the street, the brass bell above the door chiming softly as he entered. Priscilla turned, her clipboard lowering slowly as her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the bustling energy of the boutique completely vanished, leaving only the two of them suspended in the quiet, fragile space between their painful past and their unwritten future. She took in the sight of him, the cane, the softer lines around his dark eyes, the complete absence of the looming, lethal shadow that used to follow him everywhere. She didn't ask why he was there. She already knew the answer. Priscilla closed the distance between them, stepping carefully around the vibrant displays. When she looked up into his eyes, there was no fear, no lingering resentment, only a profound, overwhelming relief. She reached out, her fingertips gently tracing the line of his jaw. "You're late," she whispered. A single tear slipped free to catch the warm afternoon light. Kang-lee dropped his cane. It clattered harmlessly to the floor as he pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in the soft crook of her neck. He breathed in the scent of jasmine and vanilla, wrapping his arms around the only empire he had ever truly wanted to protect. "I'm done running," he murmured against her skin, his voice thick with quiet emotion. "I'm finally home." Sometimes the hardest battle isn't fighting your enemies, but fighting for the one you love. Kang-lee walked away from an empire of shadows and endless bloodshed to build a legitimate, peaceful life in the light with Priscilla. Did he make the right choice, giving up his underworld crown for the woman he never stopped loving? Let me know your thoughts on this epic conclusion in the comments below. I also love seeing how far our community reaches, so drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. If you enjoyed Kang-lee and Priscilla's journey, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more intense, action-packed romance stories just like this one. Until next time.